So timesheets is one of those things that's difficult. As I was going through this agenda, it's something that I could have spent, several hours, if not an entire day, talking about timesheets. So I've parsed it down, obviously, for our 30-minute session and the little bit at the end then for Q&A. So what we'll be going through today, timesheet setup reports, data capture, some kind of hints and tricks on extended use, time entry tabs, internal switches, options for auto-population. Certainly there's business considerations with that. When all else fails, any sort of scripting solution, any sort of timesheet corrections that need to take place, as much as I like to say, everyone's putting in their time and they're doing a perfect job of it. So with the timesheet setup, so really it's a matter of preparing for your data capture and how do you want this configured at your organization level. Things like the timesheet rules underneath the administration, application settings, and then timesheet settings, the rules allow you to set parameters for your timesheets. For example, you can set a minimum number of hours either as a fixed number or as a percentage of a user's work schedule, assuming you're using work schedules, so that users cannot submit or they either get a warning or an error message if they try to submit a timesheet for less than the required number of hours, say if it's 35 hours per week or so forth. In general, I typically recommend using a percent, just because if folks have work schedules set up for full-time and part-time employees, then you're not having to set up actual fixed numbers, which might not apply to a part-time employee. You can also define here within the timesheet rules what happens when a user clones his or her timesheet. Should the hours clear or should they stay the same from a cloned week? And I will talk in a little bit further on in the presentation about timesheet clones if you're not familiar with that feature. It's a very, very nice feature. Other settings for the timesheets, you can set periods. Generally, I recommend weekly timesheets. However, depending on the organization and your business practice, I do have some folks we've worked with who submit timesheets monthly, and they allow their folks to go ahead and enter that time monthly and submit once. Then me being I can't remember what I had for breakfast, it's much more effective, I found, for myself to enter my time on a daily basis, and then obviously our internal policy is submitting timesheets at weekend. Alerts and notifications. These can be configured to send to users who meet defined criteria, such as a late timesheet reminder. Within OpenAir, you can set a time when an alert runs or multiple alerts. If, for example, you need to send one every 15 minutes to users who haven't yet submitted their timesheet. And then if, the idea is just slam them with those reminders until they get it in, and then they'll get sick of getting them, so they'll get it in on time next time. And again, that's defined on a set of criteria. Alerts and notifications both are able to have customized text. So if you want to say that your email is from a certain person, or you can configure who the email comes from, what it shows up as in the user's inbox. With some of the recent changes on the notification side, notifications are now more configurable to set different criteria, whereas in the past they were a simple reminder based on an event such as just a late timesheet with no regard for user department or any other user criteria based on the timesheet. So depending what types of alerts and heads up you want to give folks. And then, we've also got advanced reporting. So underneath reports, there's the advanced option. Those are a lot of pre-built reports. For example, if your timesheets are due, Monday at 5 o'clock, for example, you could send up each Monday at noon maybe to send out as a reminder, and also provide a chart or a visual as to who has not yet submitted a timesheet. And in the advanced report, you have the option to include multiple periods. So if you want to include the previous 4 weeks, so you can see that Joe Smith has submitted his timesheet the first 2 weeks of the month, but last week and this week, for example, he has not submitted it. So it provides you a visual review as well. But overall, the timesheet setup is highly configurable and can generally meet your organizational needs. It's not often that we get into situations where we get hung up too much on timesheets because of the amount of configuration allowed. Looking at a couple different types of data capture, there are a couple fields that I like to use and potentially repurpose on timesheets. The first of the fields is called Payroll Type. It's a native field called Payroll Type, and you can rename it if you are not familiar with renaming. If you're an administrator or have access to the terminology section on the Administration and Global Settings page, there's a terminology page, and you can rename Payroll Type, for example, to something like customer location or work location. This is a field, this particular Payroll Type field is often renamed to one of those two, although we could certainly rename it to, or you can certainly rename it to any number of things. From a tax perspective, we'll often configure states and or countries to when folks are logging time so that they can capture where the work was performed. And then when this field is configured to show on the time entry form, the field can be indicated as required, and users must select a location for each time entry line. There is the ability to set a default location on the main timesheet form as well if there's not a concern for the individuals updating the individual lines. You can just set a default and they can choose it and then update individual lines as they need. So it's kind of like a pre-populate situation. But most importantly, with this, if you're capturing this data for any reason, you have the ability to report and subtotal on the field, see how many approved and or billed hours were worked in a given area. Again, most often this is used from a tax perspective and capturing those locations from there. Another field that we'll use is a control field called time type. This is unique to the timesheet and the time entry form, and it can also, similar to payroll type, be used to capture various levels of data. The three different ones that we use most often are to capture whether that time type is billable or not billable. So for each individual line, is that particular item billable? Now, if you do this, this part definitely would have considerations because here, this would be if you're using the time type maybe in lieu of task type, which is defined at the task level and is a sticky field where it's not controlled by the end user. You're granting that consultant or that employee control of what is considered client billable work, both from potentially a billing standpoint, but also from a utilization standpoint as well. So definitely something to consider if you're going to use this for billable, non-billable, and give that control to the consultant entering time versus setting a task type at the task level within the project and not having that field visible or editable. Another option, because you can include time type as a project billing rule filter, is to capture overtime. So maybe if you bill out overtime hours at a different rate to a client, you've got up to 40 hours at X rate, but anything over 40 hours in a given week is billed at Y rate. You can set that up and say any time type which is tagged as overtime, which the users would flag on their timesheet, gets billed out at a different rate. And then that would automatically bill as per the rule. And then more simplistic on-site remote, kind of a generic capture, but still important nonetheless, especially if you're planning on doing time studies to determine where users spend their time, or as a further qualifier to the work location. Did they work in Colorado, but they were remote? Did they work in Colorado, but they were on-site? So just configuring it to on-site and remote. And then when using, and you're also, again, at the project level, when you're using this field, you can define, there's an internal switch that is enabled to say which time types are allowed at that project level. So for example, maybe on an internal project or maybe on any given project, you're only going to have remote work. You don't even want to give people the option to select on-site because you know for that particular project you're not going to have it, and you don't want that as an option. You can limit that on the properties page. And again, that's an internal switch to enable that field, and then you can set that accordingly. The time entry tab is a really nice way to quickly reference individual time entries and sort out specific hours. It's enabled via an internal switch, and if you need to view time entries for a particular contractor, for example, or even an employee, this particular field will parse out the detail on a day-by-day and line-by-line level. Once you've got your data in there, you can use your column list filters and or the advanced filters on the page to search for a particular time entry. There really aren't a whole lot of downsides to this feature and making it available for everyone. However, if you wanted to keep it simple in a streamlined form for users within your organization to use, you can certainly limit access to the time entries tab based on the role permissions. Timesheet population. Talked about this briefly at the beginning of the call. This particular one, there's a few different options here. And you've got an option to auto-populate timesheet based on user booking. This will take if a user is booked for 8 hours every day this week on Project X. This would take Project X, populate that in their timesheet when they create the timesheet for that week, and fill in 8 hours. The pro of that is that it saves time, especially if someone is working on a number of projects and they're pretty consistent of what their time entries match up on their bookings. One consideration are potential timesheet errors. If you're going to pre-populate the booking information onto the timesheet, you've got to make sure that users realize that they need to update their hours accordingly, assuming that those hours might vary. So if they're just going to let them populate and hit the submit button without looking at it, then you might not want to populate all of the data based on the bookings. One slightly scaled back option is to populate just the time off or schedule requests into the timesheet. Of course, users can still edit the number of hours actually taken versus what was requested and put into that schedule request. But if you want to save them that time, at least when they pull up their timesheet, it'll populate and say schedule request or time off, depending on your organizational wording there, and populate with the number of hours accordingly. The timesheet clone feature, this is a fantastic feature, and with this, users have the option to, on the timesheet, to define which timesheet they want to clone, and within the rules, behind the scenes at an organizational level, you have the ability to configure for everyone, if they do clone a timesheet, do you want to clear all of the hours out, basically cloning over the project and the task, and then having them enter that quantitative data in their timesheet, or do you want to leave the hours the same from week to week? Again, one concern or consideration that you would need to put into that are if folks are going to clone a timesheet from week to week and you're going to allow the hours to be the same, will the users realize that they need to update their hours specific to that week rather than just leave the hours in there if they would vary? So this is definitely very, very helpful if users are working on the same projects from one period to the next, and or have a number of projects and tasks that they must select each time. So saving them the time entry and the selection on the timesheets when entering those. And when all else fails, write a script. I put a little asterisk, or you can have Top Step write a script. So the scripting functionality allows for customization to meet your business needs. And again, for those of you not familiar with our scripting services, we do have a team who writes these, and we also have a marketplace, which I've got a link as well. But you can definitely write scripts if the native functionality doesn't meet exactly what you need it to. A couple of scripts or a few different scripts that we've done. The first one, the budget check. This will provide a notification outside of a separate report and more or less real time as the hours are entered by the user. This will send, this particular script will send an email alert to the project manager or any person overseeing the project and give them more immediate insight into how a user's time is being spent and logged for the individual task. So this provides maybe a step more proactive than looking at a report maybe the next week as to your status on any given task and how you're doing against the budget for that particular task. A couple other scripts that we've written are the budget alert, worked versus approved hours. This is similar to the budget check. This can compare those hours that are worked, i.e. those hours that are entered but not yet submitted, and the project manager, for example, can see the updates as the users are entering time throughout the week, ideally. Ideally, they're not waiting until the very last minute, 5 o'clock on a Friday, to put their time in. I know it happens. Raise my hand, myself included sometimes. And but you're able to look at those worked versus approved hours. So again, you can a little bit more proactively monitor if a task or a project is going to go over budget rather than finding out after the fact. Something that's not timesheet related but is in the timesheets module is a PTO increment check. Again, as some of you probably have seen and used, there is the ability to enter schedule requests or time off requests as well as time off entries in OpenAir. And by default, users can request and take any amount of time on the time off script with something like, or with the time off feature, with something like the script in place to check the PTO increments. It'll allow you to limit time off to maybe 4 8-hour, half or full days to keep a much cleaner burn down on your PTO. Timesheet adjustments, because there's always that one person that puts it in, it slips through, gets approved, and then, oh shoot, I had a fat finger and typed in 10 instead of 1, or selected the wrong project, maybe the wrong task. So any number of items there could result in timesheet adjustments. So depending on the frequency and the magnitude of timesheet adjustments within your organization, along with where in the process the timesheet is or has been, various methods are available. And they go from a very simplistic to a little bit more, I don't really want to call it complex, but the formal adjusting approved timesheet requires a little bit more maybe controls in place. One option is simply unapproving the timesheet for end user correction. Obviously, you can't unapprove a timesheet that has been processed for billing, so long as that hasn't run through and you don't have charges associated with that timesheet yet. If someone submits it, approves it, and then realizes maybe later that day or the next day or maybe even early the next week, assuming it's not a month end, just a matter of unapproving the timesheet for end user correction. There is at the user level a checkbox that must be selected to allow a particular user to unapprove a timesheet as well. So if you only want to limit the unapproving to administrators or managers, for example, you can control that at a user level. And then it's up to the user to either fix their timesheet or that manager, administrator, whoever that might be, proxying in as the user to fix the timesheet and resubmit it. Another option that you could do, there is a setting that will allow you to create an overlapping timesheet. And for those of you who are not using it, it's a setting, it's a checkbox on when you go to create a new timesheet. It says allow overlapping timesheets. So if I've already created a timesheet for last week, it'll say in my list of timesheets that have been created that exists, but then I can do a second one. And then from there, you can go ahead, just enter in any sort of adjustments and submit, whether they be negative or positive. The last one, and this tends to be the most common one that I work with, just because it's the cleanest overall. Again, maybe debatable cleanest next to the unapproved timesheet, depending where you're at there. But adjusting an approved timesheet, this is controlled by two different settings. It's a role permission and it's an internal switch. So first and foremost, you have to have the internal switch enabled. Secondly, based on the role, you got to allow that particular role to adjust an approved timesheet. And the approved timesheet can be adjusted if the timesheet, again, is activated. What you would do then is you go into edit mode, and then with the dialog box on the left, assuming that's enabled and then that role has the ability, you'll see an option that will say adjust this timesheet. And when you click on adjust, what it does is it opens up the timesheet in edit mode. You make your changes to reflect what the timesheet should have looked like in the first place, and then it gives you an option to put any sort of notes, and then below the notes box it actually gives you a breakdown of what the timesheet now looks like. And when you submit that, again, there's another internal switch that you can say any adjusted timesheet, automatically approve it when it's resubmitted, so then it doesn't have to go back through an approval process, again, assuming that you've got someone like an administrator or a manager, someone who already knows and is aware of the approval that's going to be, of the changes that are going to be made, and have approved them. From then, you would see in the list of timesheets here, I've got my 816 to 822 timesheet. I've got that one, and then I can see that the second timesheet was created, and then that's marked in brackets that it's an adjusted timesheet. And I had to leave this slide in there because, first of all, this is just a fantastic movie, and I just love this caption. So while you're looking at that, in summary, timesheets are a basic requirement for many OpenAir users. There's really not, at a minimum, if folks are just using OpenAir for basic time entry, that's usually the most basic piece that they'll be using it for. So pretty much everyone is using it for that. Taking advantage and leveraging the settings to limit and control alerts and approvals for more effective communication and system adoption. Take advantage of features to reduce risk in data entry, mistakes, and to make life easier for your administrators for sure, assuming they're the ones making some of these changes. And as discussed before, timesheet setup and configuration is quite customizable. Best practices should be used as a core, and expansions to the functionality added on based on your organizational goals and needs. And of course, if you wanted to have any questions, to give us a call to talk through any sort of timesheet challenge, there are plenty of other unique options awaiting you. And then just as a reminder, just a little bit about the business. For folks, I mentioned this earlier, we have a PSA extension marketplace for pre-built script options, and we've got about 20 in our marketplace right now that are available if you want to take a look through there to see if there's anything that kind of quick and easy and easily repeatable scripts are what we've got in there for folks, but certainly we've done some very complex scripts in general. So at this point, I'm going to stop the recording, and then I will unmute the lines and open it up for any sort of questions from the group.